Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be.
Hello, folks. Welcome back. Another weekend here with Rick Widener, getting it right on KNZZ, KGLN, the internet, podcasting, and perhaps being radiated into space for future civilizations of aliens to be able to glean some information about us. Anyway, welcome back. I appreciate your listenership. Let's set this program off today about talking about missiles. Simply because we've been hearing a lot about them and not enough about them. And we hear some kind of strange comparisons. And so I thought we'd do a little research and help us understand these things a little better. As you know, I'm not a fan of news that gives you talking points about something, and then you realize that, yeah, I know what they're saying, but I don't understand a lot about what they're talking about. It's easy to happen in today's world. We also pick up all sorts of phrasing. And you see this. I mean, the Democrats are great at this. Something happens, and then 5 minutes later, they're all saying the exact same thing at the exact same time. But beyond that, certain terms just pop up and get used across the board, particularly in the media. For instance, when do you think that we started using the words, person of interest? Isn't that a suspect? I mean, I'm fine with saying person of interest, except that I think it's silly. Are you just interested in them? What way? Would you like to have lunch with them? Is that what you're saying? Have they written something you'd like to read? I mean, come on. This all started when there was a lot of complaints coming about using the word suspect in connection with individuals, and particularly in areas where there was a lot of race-conscious things and stuff like that, it tended to brand people in that sense, give them an identity that maybe they didn't deserve. They're just a suspect. I mean, that doesn't mean you don't remain a suspect forever, right? But it can stick in with you if something doesn't happen and they get somebody else. And the idea that you're a suspect, that term, makes people feel more strongly that, oh yeah, they're pretty close to thinking they did it. So I suppose person of interest is a milder way of doing it. But I dislike this sort of very distant sort of speaking. So where you're just sort of obviating what you're really wanting to say. These phrases. But anyway, I use that because that just started coming up a few years ago. Now it's everywhere. I haven't heard anybody use the word suspect, at least not in their lead-off, in a long time. And so there we have it. But some of the terms that we just use about, let's say ballistic missiles. How many times have you heard them say, it's like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet? Well, I think that's actually a useful metaphor. But what else would you like to know about that? I mean, these are things that hopefully won't come up in our country, but nevertheless help us understand the news better. For instance, this week, as we know, Iran has some of the, I think it's a Sea-3, but they're medium-range ballistic missiles. And they have about a 2,000-kilometer range. And I think that they're, just judging from the stuff I've seen, that they're somewhat accurate to about 200, 220 meters. So they're pretty good, considering. Iran hasn't had this kind of stuff very much, and things are mixed about how long they've had these. I think they started developing them with help from somebody, Russians, Chinese, something, probably 2009. It takes a while to develop this stuff. These things aren't cheap either, by the way. These ballistic missiles, these medium-range ballistic missiles, are different than the missiles they had been sending before. And there is a subtle difference between rockets and missiles. I mean, people use them interchangeably. Usually rockets are things that are fired at a low trajectory, a low arc, sort of like firing a 4th of July little piece of exploding equipment there and pointing it at something and then having an arc on it. That's more like a rocket. Rockets have been around a long time. The first use of rockets are very, very old, and they were wildly, let's say, dangerous to operate because they were inaccurate and all sorts of things could happen to them. They would fire usually a group of them out of like a very kind of medieval-looking apparatus, and some of them go off, some of them wouldn't, but they were random enough and weird enough that they've had a good effect on the battlefield. But so rockets are still in use, and they can carry a payload. It's very simple, and they're usually not particularly big. But they're also low-flying, so they're kind of hard to see. They're also much cheaper. And as we know, drones especially, which are much cheaper, maybe $20,000 a piece with some munitions on board, for instance, and rockets maybe 2 or 3 times that, depending on the kind of rocket and its size. But you have to shoot them down with something that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's a lot harder to track it and knock it out than it is to fire it. I mean, I think we can figure that. But when you start talking about and getting into the ideas of these ballistic missiles, like that Iran has been using, these medium range, first of all, some rockets, this is something they share in common, some rockets are solid fueled because they're small, easy transportable, often in the back of like a tactical, which is usually, maybe a pickup truck in the bed of it. They can be some other configurations to use for launchers. They may have solid fuel, but most of the time anything a little bigger than that is a liquid fuel. And it takes a little bit of time to get it launched. Now, the ones they're using now, these medium-range ballistic missiles, have 2 things that are very different. One is their solid fuel, which is more expensive, and it makes them able to be utilized much faster. You don't have to get them out, fuel them up, get them on the launch pad, make sure your fuel's in there, take off all of your fueling equipment. They're ready. Secondly, these are 2-stage missiles. So they hit up in a high arc, and then at some point in the high arc, they disengage the first thrusting portion of the missile, and it drops away on whomever happens to be standing down there. Think of it. So, if you're living in Jordan and Syria, having this stuff like drop out of the sky on you seems like a little bit of a problem. But beyond that, then the second stage kicks in, and they become quite fast. They're fast all the way, but then they really kick up because they're in a higher trajectory in the upper atmosphere. Now this, knocking them out with a bullet thing, let me give you the analogy. If they're using one of these intermediate range, they're hypersonic, which we're barely getting into, but the Russians seem to have had it for a while. That means that they travel over Mach 3, usually, or it's 3 times the speed of sound. These are going between 5 and 6 Mach, 5 and 6. Now, let me give you an idea. If you're going at Mach 5, and depending on the temperature and the thickness or thinness of the atmosphere that you're in, it's moving about 5,300 feet per second. If you want a comparison, standard 230 grain 45 caliber bullet fired from a government issue 45 travels about 830 to 850 feet per second. That's the difference. They're much faster than a bullet. It's hard for us to even imagine how fast they would go past us. So, talk about how you try and knock them out. Okay, folks, thanks for sticking with me. I don't want to be super technical, but I think the audience out there is quite capable of having a technical grasp of what's going on, because it's what's happening. And the idea that people are just lobbing something over to somebody else and it's blowing up, and they're, I don't think that's as particularly helpful, because it's hard to process. Maybe that we get in the weeds a little too much if we explain it, but I find it interesting, and it tells us a little more about what's going on and what's possibly going on in the future with all this stuff. Israel, now we talked about the missiles from Iran. Israel has kind of a layered defense system for these kinds of things. It's sort of an architecture, and it kind of works for varying velocities and ranges. And the first part of it is what we're very familiar with, the Iron Dome. Now that's supposed to intercept short-range rockets and mortars, like 70 kilometers, something like that. It can intercept some of those Tamir missiles they talk about and some of the rockets that are firing. But the speed of these targets, from what the research I've done for the Iron Dome, pick up typically between 1/2 to 1 Mach, right? So 1/2 to 1 time the speed of sound. But they are very effective against things like that. They've shown to be almost 90% effective against those. And those are the large volume of missiles and rockets that are getting launched, right? The next layer that they have is what's called David's Sling. And it's for the medium to long range cruise and ballistic missiles. Now, ballistic missiles, as we know, usually have an arc. Cruise missiles usually are much flatter and fly sort of like a big drone. Much harder to detect. If they're sophisticated enough, they can evade. If they're sophisticated enough, they have ground sensing radar or GPS. Ground sensing radar is a little better, so if you don't get GPS knocked out for some reason. And they're working apparently, from what I see, out to about 300 kilometers. And they're usually used against the stunner missiles, as they're called. And they're effective against those kind of missiles up to about Mach 7, which we were talking about at the terminal velocity reentry of these medium-range ballistics. And they can have some capability to intercept something that's maneuvering, especially at the very end, the terminal phases, like to call it. But if you send more than one or two things, it strains their defense system here, this David Slings. And especially if you have high maneuverability drones or cruise missiles, and they're just hard to follow when you fire more than one or two of them at a time, it's more likely to get some of them through. The next layer is of their Arrow 2 and 3. I wrote this down. I'm trying to read my handwriting. These are long-range, what they call extra-atmospheric interceptors. And they're made to collect these intermediate-range ballistic missiles, medium-range, what do you call them. And they're designed to counter threats up to Mach 10 to 15. Now, when we're saying about Mach 7, what we're talking about is a terminal velocity of some of these really fast missiles. That's as they're descending and coming towards the target. At their peak, it's sort of in the moderately high level of the stratosphere, they can reach speeds up to 10 to 12 or even more Mach. So you're trying to hit these things as far away as possible, but you need time, right? And there's been some success. The medium-range ballistic missiles, their Arrow 2 apparently has been pretty effective, and that would be something that kind of works against these ones they're firing now, the two-stage rockets that they're using with solid fuel. However, here's where it gets goofy. These things are $2 to $3 million a piece. And you got to fire a few of them sometimes to get one. And you're not always completely successful in that. So you have to have almost perfect target prediction and very high-speed processing to be able to do that. In other words, somebody has to be able to figure this out, or you get a fire control kind of message that is done very quickly and can be developed in amazingly short periods of time. I mean, the Iranians have been firing missiles of all sorts. They started off firing like 400 a day. They've been knocking out the launchers for all types of these missiles, particularly the rockets and the lower-end missiles. And so now Iran is firing about 60 of everything a day. That's kind of the last estimate. But at the same time, these Arrow and David Sling, the very expensive intercept capability, their inventory is getting low. And of course they are, because they're really expensive. And the idea that it is much cheaper to just throw things at somebody than it is to try and knock the thing you throw out of the air. I mean, that I think we all understand that. There are some other types of systems out there, and people have actually asked me about that. Because, you know, we watch all science fiction, and so we wonder, what about lasers? Well, there actually are some lasers out there. And the Israelis have what's called the Iron Beam, and it's a directed energy laser weapon. And they have been using it, even right now. It's just out of testing phase. It works best with, like, small drones, mortars, low-end, maybe a low-end ballistic missile. And, of course, what these do is they attempt, and later on when we talk about there's a microwave one too, what they're trying to do is not slice through it like a lightsaber, I wish we could, but hit it with enough energy that it eats these things up to where the fuel or the warhead explodes prematurely, right? And if they work, they're much cheaper. I mean, you can fire one of these things once you have it figured out at less than $1 a time when you pull the trigger, assuming there is an actual trigger. I don't think there is. And so they're working on that, but they require a lot of power. And so they have to be deployed on the battlefield where they can have power generated to get to them. They're effective about the 7 kilometers, so 3 miles is probably a good shot at what they're effective in. But they got to be on target. They've got to be on the target for a certain period of time to heat these things up. So what we need here is what we're all talking about now is AI technology that allows tracking and firing solutions to be deployed much faster than humans can do so. And that is one of the best ways to incorporate into these beam weapons, or even the long-range interceptors, than what we're doing now. And this laser, you get the quadricopters, FPV. The one I always like that they use, you'll see this small loitering munitions. I saw that phrase, loitering munitions. This is sort of a drone that will go to a spot and just hover and then attack at a different time, so that it doesn't have a moving profile until the last minute. So it's a strange word, a loitering munitions. There's also some things in development out here, I think, in the Israelis, and these are really going to be reflected in what's going on with the United States as well. They have one they call Skysonic, and that's high-power microwave, right? And same kind of idea. We've been testing it in the United States and in Germany for a while, which is just putting a microwave beam at the thing and heating it up just like you would your soup, and hopefully it blows up. They would be more effective against some of these medium-range things than almost anything, because you can fire multiple times. Eventually, we're going to have some artificial intelligence-enhanced systems that'll have some real-time tracking, and that would radically improve the ability to intercept. They're working on that now. This is one of the many reasons why we can't let somebody else win this AI race, because this is one of the things it's going to get used for. Unfortunately, we can't control what other people use AI for. And just because we don't like the idea of it in some situations doesn't mean they don't. So we at least have to be able to understand it and counter it, if not be able to do it ourselves. And it's happening very fast out there. I don't know where this is going to lead. We're entering a very different kind of warfare right now. Iran, as we mentioned before, doesn't really have an effective ground force, to say nothing about the fact that they got a lot of distance to go over the ground to get to Israel. It would probably, most likely, be an amphibious landing, and they don't really have the capability to do that at all. They're not going to be a D-Day from Iran at Haifa or someplace like that. So what they're just trying to do is destroy the will of the Israeli people to fight. This is terrible, but it's hardly new. They're going to keep blowing things up in Israel until Israel either blows them up so they can't fire anything, or Israel stops. They're going to stop. All right. Thanks for hanging around, everybody. We're back on our short little break. During the break, I checked some sources to make sure that nothing that was very close to us blew up, just because everything seems to be changing all the time. Seems like we're all right. Just to kind of enlarge a little bit on the last two segments, is I know they're technical, but I think it really helps us understand what we're talking about, is the Iranian military, such that it is apparently they're running out of ammunition, including rockets and missiles. So they're getting very low on those. And what many worry about, or smart people worry about, and I'm talking about like General Jack Keane, who you see on Fox sometimes, from the Institute for the Study of War, and then if you go to Strategica, some of those other places that are smart people about this stuff, that they worry that the people that run things in Tehran are just so nuts that essentially they don't know when to give up, right? And so they may turn to other methods if they run out of conventional or near conventional munitions. So the big thing they're thinking is some kind of cyber attack on our power grid. That may be coming if they're trying to, target us directly. There's also the opportunity for activating sleeper cells that might be in the country. And as we know, the people that are associated with the regime over there are not really stable like we would think of stable. So you don't know what they might be doing and what they might be capable of here. So that's a big concern, and apparently they're trying to address it in some way. So that's kind of where we're at now. We'll see if they get close to running out of stuff. And people have been saying that the Chinese aircraft that they've been seeing flying into Iran, what are they bringing? It's unlikely they're bringing missiles or rockets. It's unlikely they're bringing the big CJ-3, not something you're going to get in an airplane unless it's a really big airplane. So it's still unlikely that they're bringing that kind of stuff, because if it's missiles and rockets and some of these more complex items that are manufactured in China, we're going to be able to figure out where they come from. Some of them will have enough detritus left over that we'll be able to look at it, be able to scientifically study it, and determine where it came from. And if some of them, for instance, don't completely blow up, which does happen with these things, that'll make it pretty easy. So I don't believe the Chinese, and most of the other people don't believe the Chinese are going to be sending anything into Iran that will immediately be able to trace back to China. So there is a question there. Maybe it's food stuff, maybe it's regular ammunition, things like that, but I don't know that it might be anything more sophisticated. Most of the experts don't think so, but then you never know these people. Also, it's been not a great week for Iran. On Friday, they had, I guess it would have been Thursday night there. I have to think about which direction the time zones go. They had a earthquake, a 5.1 earthquake there. I don't know about you, but considering what's going on, recording an earthquake, we detect an earthquake with the seismographs, right? In Iran, with them being bombed and them having all of these underground structures and so forth, I don't really have a theory about it, but it's just kind of an interesting coincidence, if there is such a thing. Anyway, so this has not been going on very well. And, the regime, it's like we like to refer to it, is, it's a theocracy. It's made up of individuals who run things based on their interpretation of their religion, which may or may not be what everybody else's interpretation is. It certainly isn't the same interpretation that they have in Saudi Arabia and so forth. Also, the people that are doing it are relatively old. As we know in our country, sometimes that's not the greatest thing in terms of decision-making. They don't appear to be afraid of blowing a lot of people up. Also, there's some sort of brinkmanship going on here. Some of the experts are saying that they think that the Ayatollahs believe that they can weather this storm and rebuild their nuclear facility. That enough of the infrastructure in various places, because this stuff's strung out all over the place in Iran. The big one's under that mountain that we may use a bunker buster on, and there is still some question about if that would even be enough. Many think it is. Some, we don't know enough about the target to really be certain. But it seems as though there is some intelligence that says, look, these guys are thinking that, they don't have to surrender, cave in, or negotiate, because they figure that at some point Israel and whomever are going to get tired of blowing things up and can't find anything else, and they probably have some stuff squirreled away that nobody knows about, and they can reassemble in a year or two, maybe longer, back to their nuclear program. So they think they can weather it. Now, how the general population in Iran feels about that is a good question. There's a lot of pushback from the Iranian people, particularly those in Tehran and some of the larger metropolitan areas. And it's been tough because, like we've mentioned before, the Ayatollahs in this country have complete control over everything. And they have a relatively sophisticated, this isn't Afghanistan, relatively sophisticated controls over their internet and even radio getting in there and what people are doing, and you really take your life in your hands if you're trying to send some kind of message out or something. So they've really got their boot on these people, and it makes it pretty hard to do too much. And they're not afraid to be extreme with them if they get out of line. So there's more there than meets the eye for these people to really throw these guys out. And also there's the fact that these people in this government know that if it falls, if they lose power, it's not going to be good for them, like personally. So they're going to hold on pretty hard. Now, can they get some kind of sanctuary someplace? Well, it's going to be hard. Most of the countries surrounding them are not fans. And they also know that by giving these guys sanctuary, they're going to be getting a lot of Western unhappiness. There keeps being these rumors that people in the government of Iran are contacting Russia, which would kind of make sense. I mean, how much more mad can we get at Russia, right? It seems unlikely, but it wouldn't be surprising, I guess, if you think about it. Putin would be happy to have people who are more disruptive to the West come in over there, but it would be very difficult for them, I would think, because their whole existence is wrapped up in this ruling by their interpretation of their religion. But important to know, like I said, this isn't Afghanistan. And the thing that sets this apart, well, many things set it apart, but one of the larger things is that this population, and many of them, the older people within memory, had a completely different lifestyle. Iran was pretty cosmopolitan in the 70s. And when the Shah was there, who we kind of kept on the throne, things were fairly modern. People wore modern clothing. Women were allowed to be out in the streets. They might even be able to read. Who knows? I mean, this is the kind of crazy stuff that goes on there. Women were a lot more free. It was much better for everybody. And when Khomeini, remember this is Khomeini and Khomeini, these names of these imams are, in 79, when the Shah ran out, and we did nothing to kind of help him. And actually, if you go back and look, the Carter administration kind of facilitated this change of government to this theocracy. I think the Ayatollah that took over at that time, I want to say he was in France, in exile in France, and came back. I'd have to look that up. I can't remember. But so, unfortunately, Jimmy Carter was probably, within modern times, certainly, used to be the worst foreign policy president that we'd had. Remember, think about the Panama Canal, Subic Bay and the PI, then, of course, Iran. He seemed to want to keep giving things that were items that could be used against us back to people who didn't like us. So that was all because of the human rights. Remember, if you go back and look, they decided the Shah's regime was pretty heavy-handed, and it was, compared it to, say, Italy or France or something. But compared to what's going on now, no, not at all, not even close. So Carter concentrated on this human rights thing and thought, well, the Shah's got to go. The Shah, by the way, occupies the peacock throne in Iran, in case you hear that, because they're talking about, what if he returned? What if the Shah, of course, from that period is past, but his son is still there and claims that he's still the Shah of Iran and would like to just wait these people out. Who knows how that's going to go? But you have to remember, these people that live there, many of them remember having a lot more freedom, a lot more access to goods and services, being able to move around. It was much more inclusive for women. It was very different, really. If you go back and look at even photographs and stuff from mid to late 70s in Iran, Tehran, you wouldn't recognize it compared to what it is now. So there's a movement that would like to get rid of that, but the stranglehold that the government has, it has a very sophisticated internal governance apparatus, secret police, 2 or 3 other branches. Instead of having an army really that is much good outside of Iran or defending the borders, it's pretty much concentrated on the population. This is one of the reasons they don't really have any land force they can do much with right now. And they use proxies like the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., to sort of deal blows to the people they don't like. They don't really have, they certainly have practically no Navy. They're going to have almost no, if not any, Air Force after we've blown pretty much everything we could find up, not only the planes, but the airfields. And they're not, like we said a couple times here before, they're not going to be launching an amphibious attack on Israel from Iran. Now, Iran used to have a fairly large force when they were fighting Saddam Hussein. Remember, they had a war, 10 years long between Iraq and Iran? But all that's kind of in the past now. And most of their ideas about force projection are internal, which means it's not going to be very easy to just turn the switch and say, okay, you guys need to get out of here, especially when they know that some of them that they can't get sanctuary are going to be, it's not going to go well for them. So they're going to hold on like grim death to these things. So we will have to see how that goes. It's interesting to look at because on the one hand, you would think it'd be more likely to get regime change because you have a number of people who over time had lived very differently than they do now. At the same time, that was 79, and you have a government whose sole purpose seems to be to make everybody do what they say exactly, and have really given up on projecting anything outside of the country other than terrorism and stuff like that, money. So it's hard to say how that comes out in the end. Certainly there's one piece of it that gives a lot of impetus towards, changing the regime, assuming that we, do enough damage to the infrastructure to where it's hard for them to keep control of everything. On the other hand, they've got a lot of internal controls. So I think we're going to have to see. All the experts that you read about say that it's a heavy pull to get regime change there. We keep talking about it like, regime change. It's going to take a lot of damage to break that hold that the sort of internal security apparatus has. So, although it's a terrible thing to see, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. We don't know as much about what goes on in Iran. Obviously, the Israelis do. Israel and Mossad and some of their other intelligence agencies are amazing in terms of their penetration with their intelligence network into the countries that don't like them, particularly Iran. Think about the pager thing. Remember that? They set up a company to manufacture and distribute pagers because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and all that other people had found that cell phone communication was too easily intercepted. So they went back to pagers, which are much more difficult, obviously. You page somebody to go to a landline or whatever this case may be. So Israel sets up this company and surreptitiously ends up building the pagers for these guys. And then, as we know last year, they blew them up. And that gives you some idea of the strategy of Israel. They are deeply embedded intelligence-wise into that country. And if you look at Iran's, just kind of their internal news, they are constantly accusing people of being spies. I mean, it's really easy to be accused of being a spy in Iran because they know there's a lot of them there. They know there are a lot of people who they're not even necessarily from Israel, but there's a certain group of people, as we were just talking about, that are very unhappy that would be glad to give some information to another country that might cause this regime to fall. So they're really on the razor's edge. If you look cross-eyed at somebody, you're a spy, and they're going to do something really bad if they think that there's any possible truth to that. So the whole thing is a good study, if you want to say that. And if you guys want to know what's going on, it's fine to watch the news, but sometimes you need to go to some primary sources. I mean, the Jerusalem Post online is obviously tends towards Israeli point of view, but there's some stories in there that you don't hear anyplace else that give you some information. Also, you look at some of the just defense places out there, like Jane's Defense, where they talk about the weaponry and capabilities. You get the Hoover Institute, Strategica. There's several others, if you look around out there, that give you the idea what's really going on. So it gives you a little more confidence in being able to feel like you're in on it. And now, many of you are saying, what business is it of ours? Well, I understand that completely. I'm just saying we need to understand what they're doing so we can decide if, what, when we want to defend ourselves against it, or we want to be offensive. We have not had any guidance really from the president on this, except rhetoric to some extent, that you better, something bad's going to happen, this and that. I think it's very difficult when you're dealing with people that don't care if something bad happens. They think they can survive it and then go on about their business. So that's a difficult bargaining position for anybody to be in. And that is sort of the position that the president is now. You have people that you really going to have to bring a big stick to get their attention. Because otherwise they think they can just hunker down, and they don't really care as much about civilian casualties as Western countries and Israel do. They're going to hunker down. They've distributed their resources for this nuclear programs all over the place. We think the Israelis know where most of them are at, but maybe they don't. And even if they do, it doesn't mean we can destroy all of them. At some point, you have to remember that warfare isn't going to be necessarily won from the air. People talk about all the time about missiles and drones and this and that. And yes, you can really change the face of the battlefield. But it's very difficult to control the ground without somebody on the ground. And talking about going into some of these installations, maybe breaking down some of the defenses and going into them, you're not going to do that with just shooting things at them, especially if they're really hardened against that kind of activity. So what people are worried about is that at some point there's going to be some kind of military presence there to make sure that everything has been eliminated. And of course, when you put actual troops in somebody else's country, that heightens it even more. Although you would think that shooting, rockets back and forth and of course your Air Force would be a pretty good aggravation as well. And as we talked about in the last segment, Iran has been firing missiles, rockets, and catapults, whatever else they have over there, over Syria and Jordan for quite some time. And I don't know how the Syrian Jordanians feel about their airspace, but I think that they're probably not real happy about it. But they're not doing anything. But still, the distance is pretty pronounced there. And they're running out of the big rockets. They're running out of the medium-range ballistic missiles. They're running out of their standard rocket that they often give to Hezbollah especially. And they're really low on like solid fuel missiles, launchers, stuff like that. And the Iranians the Israelis have been very good about trying to take out the launchers. It's interesting when you think about it, because you always think about destroying the munitions. But it's just like if we were trying to destroy someone's ability to fire a firearm, would we try and blow up their ammunition everywhere, or would it be more effective to disable the firearm? Well, we disable the firearm. That's what they're trying to do. So every time these guys launch some sort of missile attack, Israel is trying really hard to figure out where it's coming from and knock that launcher out. That's why it's been going from like 400 rockets a day to like 50 and 60 right now, maybe even less. So you're sitting out there with the ability to really tune in to what's going on in a very volatile part of the world and see if we get drug into it in some way or not. This is pretty new for individuals like you and I to be able to get a lot of information about what's going on someplace else. We don't have to worry about listen to some embedded reporter from CBS that tells us what's going on. We can look at a lot of other stuff too, and we can compare. So it gives us an idea of what's going on in the world. And since we'd like to not have the world come over here and do something, it's worth following. Guys, stay safe, stay cool.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.